Hi, Misha here, and we continue with British tanks, and we come to, well, a crossroads, a turning point. The Centurion Tank. And I have three models here, 1/72 scale diecast. These are actually all from Hobby Master, and while they are very similar, they do kind of show different theaters of operation. And I kind of inadvertently ended up picking them up. I kind of put back orders in different places trying to get one and ended up kind of getting up with three. But oh well, they are different. On the left, we have one as it would have served in West Germany, Berlin. It actually has the earlier style gun, sometimes called the Type A. In the middle, we have one as it would have served in the Suez Crisis against Egypt. It has the Type B gun with the fume extractor in the middle here. And then over here we have a version as it would have been used by the Australians in Vietnam. And it's a little different. It has a searchlight, spotlight, and it has a couple of spare tires. So there are small differences between all of these, but mostly just because these are relatively affordable little tanks, and why not? They're fun. And this tank is very important. It was critical to the British post-World War II. In some ways was better received than its successor, the Chieftain. And this is really where the heavy cruiser turns into the main battle tank, where it kind of folds the infantry tanks and the cruisers into one. Because really the infantry tanks hadn't been doing so great. We had, of course, the Matilda, the Valentine, which we will get to sometime, and the Churchill, which we talked about in the first video I did. That was kind of it for the infantry tanks. They thought about doing others like the Black Prince, but that didn't really go anywhere. And there was the Conqueror, but that's a story for another day. So in some ways this still was filling the cruiser role, but in effect it was being used for what we would think of as a universal tank. Some people debate universal or not. Yeah, story for another day. But the development is quite interesting, so let's get into it. Now, early on in World War II, Britain had to kind of make do with the tanks it had, doing incremental improvements because it didn't want to stop production. Not dissimilar to the Soviet Union in the T-34. So this is why you have the Crusader, the Cromwell, and the Comet that are just kind of playing on the same thing, doing little improvements, but yeah, not really something truly new. Well, by 1943, the Department of Tank Directors, they decided it's time. The war is going in our favor. New designs are coming online. We can actually throw out the playbook and start over with something new. And they put out some pretty stringent requirements. It needed to be able to take a hit from a German 88mm. It needed to be more reliable. It needed to have the same agility as a cruiser. Top speed, they were pretty relaxed on, so they needed to be better than a Churchill, but then again, a Scalded Dog is better than a Churchill when it comes to speed, especially the later Churchills. And it needed to do all this and mount a modern gun at 40 tons. Oh, and it couldn't be over like 10 inches, 10 and a half, 10 inches, that'd be something. 10 foot, 10 and a half foot, 10 inches. You know what I mean? Blah. So pretty stringent. Luckily, already by the end of that year, they dropped the weight requirement. They upped it to 45 tons because it just couldn't have the armor and have the right turret. That's another thing. They increased the turret ring by about 5-6 inches up to about 74 wide, which would easily allow for the current guns like the QF 17-pounder, also the 77mm gun, and with room to spare so they could hopefully go to even better, bigger guns later on. For once, Britain's not having to work with undersized turret, which was really a problem for the Churchill, and the Crusader. The armor was increased, and they went to sloped armor, like the T-34 and others. Now, they did get rid of the Christie suspension, going to Horseman suspension, which had pros and cons. It did save space, and it was easier to repair and whatnot, but it made it a bumpier ride for the crew cross-country. So this would be kind of the initial concept. A mock-up was shown in spring of 44, and 20 pilot models, as they call them, or as I call them, pre-production models, were ordered. And they were basically grouped into 555s with different layouts. 5 of them would have the 77 millimeter high velocity gun. These would have a Beza machine gun in the front and a hull-mounted machine gun. The other 15 would have the 17 pounder, the 76.2 millimeter. And basically it's just different layouts there. One of them would have a 20 millimeter Paulston cannon in the front. Actually, 10 of them would have the cannon in the front. And in the back would either be an escape hatch or the Beza machine gun. And then the other 5, the remaining 5, would have the Beza machine gun in the front and an escape hatch in the back, and they wouldn't have the 20 millimeter. So basically, yeah, they mix and match. 10 of them had the 20 millimeter gun. 15 had the 17 pounder, 5 had the 77 millimeter, and different Beza machine guns. And these would still be the 7.9 millimeter used on tanks. So these would be readied for production in late 44, and manufacturing would begin by early 45. And by March, April, a few test models were ready. And they were planning to ship them over to Europe. But by the time they got there in May, the war was over. First they would send 3 over, then 6. And since they were already on the continent, they just kind of practiced there. They had plenty of German hulks to practice against. And they did testing. Now this would quickly lead to the up-armored Mark II, which they'd order 800 in November of 1945, and that would lead to this entering into service officially in January of 1946. And the weights and everything changes as marks go up. We'll talk about that. Overall length, this was a longer hull than previous cruiser tanks. It's about 25 feet. And then depending on the gun, it could be anywhere from 29 feet to like 35 feet. And weights, like I said, started off at 40, quickly grew to 45. And later on, it would grow to nearly 52 for later versions, tons. And top speed, is fine, like 22, maybe 23 miles per hour. Where the early versions really fell down was range endurance. We're talking like 50, 60 miles. Of course, when they added extra fuel tanks and whatnot, this would improve, but this would all take time. Like I said, this one has the earlier style gun. Smooth here. There's a bit of an evacuator at the muzzle. Machine gun up here. So yeah, let's talk about the various marks, and then we'll talk about talk about service. So the version they initially went with had the 17 pounder, and then it had the 20 millimeter cannon and a separate mount on the turret, and they went with the escape hatch in the back instead of the Beza machine gun. And this would be produced in limited numbers in 1945, known as the Centurion Mark I. I should point out that around this time, the British were moving away from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals. So you'll see it written with an I or a 1 both ways. And this initial version had sloped armor and a welded hull, It had 76 millimeter in the front, had a very well armored turret, about 152 millimeter, pretty well armored sides, a little under 40 millimeters, and it used the Meteor engine, which was, well known already. And it would carry about 74 rounds for the main gun. It would not be long before the Mark I would be replaced by the Mark II on the production line by 1946. The main deal with the Mark II, it had much more armor, up to 118 in the front, and the sides were increased to over 50 millimeters. It also introduced a few minor changes and updates. But the first big one, and the first version that was produced in large numbers, was the Mark III. Appearing in 1948, it had an improved version of the Meteor engine, and it would introduce a new gun. Remember, they kind of planned on this from the get-go with the larger turret ring and ample turret. By the way, this was initially known as the A41 in kind of common stance, and the Mark II is known as the A41A. But they would quickly get away from this, and it would be known with later versions as the FV4007 starting off. Again, lots of changes in the military. But the new gun was the QF 20-pounder, which was about an 84 millimeter gun versus the older 76. Longer barrel, higher velocity. It was rifled and very accurate for what it was. And we started to have gun stabilization. That was a big deal. They had played around a little bit with it on earlier versions, but the Mark III was the first to really delve headlong. Also, they got rid of that 20 millimeter cannon. It was pretty much useless against armor and not effective against infantry, so it was really too little for some and too big for other uses. And so they just replaced it with a 7.9 Biza machine gun. Some sources say that it was a 7.62 Biza, but I believe it was a 7.9. Correct me if I'm wrong. I can't find any evidence that they actually made the Biza in 7.62. And this would have been too early for NATO, so it would have had to have been 30 caliber Springfield. Anyway, I digress. They continued to add doodads and widgets to it, improving things. This is a crew of 4, kind of standard. Guy, driver in the hull, 3-man turret. In a lot of ways, very standard tank. And the older Mark Is and Mark IIs in service were either just retired outright or turned into other vehicles like a recovery vehicle. And some were updated to Mark III standard if it was practical, if they were really new vehicles. So the Mark III was entering into full British service in 1950, and they start to have interested foreign customers. Now, this one here, like I said, is from West Germany, and it's kind of interesting because it has the older style of the QF-20 gun with the smooth barrel. Notice it does have a machine gun on top. Those were added later when they were kind of proven to be helpful. It also has a coaxial machine gun. So with that, let's get into the later marks and then talk about some service. British regiments started training up and getting accustomed to the new tank towards the end of 1946, and were well accustomed to it by the time of the Korean War. Also, by this point, Australia and Canada were operators. These would first land at Pujon in November of 1950. There would be 3 squadrons sent in the beginning, more later. Canada would send some as well. And they would be critical in most of the major tank battles. They did more than even American tanks there, mostly because they were available and ready, and frankly just better suited. They were kind of the newest, hottest thing. These would have been Mark IIIs, and the Mark III had the better stabilization, like I said. They went to improved design, better storage, and it really, it did very well. It was at the Imjin River, the second and third battles of the Hook, and they learned how to operate in the cold, and they learned how to go up against all kinds of vehicles. In fact, the first kill that everyone talks about that a Centurion had was actually a comet that had been captured by North Koreans. They fought against, of course, the North Koreans, also the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA. And they won a lot of praise by the Brits that drove them and the Americans. They proved to be quite agile. One thing the Centurion was designed for was good reverse and what have you. So very good combat record, and they learned lessons in Korea, which actually led to the Mark V. I'll talk about in just a second. Around the same time, 1952, they started to station these in West Germany. Before that, there were only like some light French tanks over there. So they needed something because they were more and more concerned about Soviet T-34s and IS-2s, IS-3s, what have you. And they would start to serve in the Middle East. They'd been ordered by Egypt, and Jordan would end up with some. They started to really proliferate around the world. In total, they would build just shy of 4,500 of these, with production lasting until around 1962. It's a little hard to say because even after they were done manufacturing them, they would remanufacture and upgrade and up armor and even up gun various Centurions. So they would stay in Korea to the end of the war. They would be stationed in Berlin, West Germany, and they would be transferred to Denmark and the Netherlands to help bolster European defense. Also sold to Sweden, Switzerland, and many others besides. They served in dozens of countries. South Africa, New Zealand, they all had some as well. And of course Israel. But Centurion really got around. Again, based on the lessons learned in Korea, we ended up with the Mark V. Now, this is when they had this top-mounted machine gun. They learned that in Korea, they didn't really have effective defense against infantry, and later it would be very important to defend against the newfangled helicopter. They also went away from the Biza machine guns to 7.62, they're 30-06, basically Brownings, both in the coax position and up here. And they would continue to improve gun stabilization and just overall reliability of the engine. The Mark V was a nice step forward, but it wasn't huge, and most of your older Mark IIIs would be updated to this new standard. Like I said, this one here is from the Suez Crisis. In August of 1956, a joint British-French task force would leave home via the sea, and the Brits would land tanks there in early November and quickly would take the town of Port Said, fighting against Soviet T-34s and Su-100 anti-tank vehicles. And they would do very well, not taking casualties. The problem here was more British reluctance to fully commit, not unlike some American generals in Vietnam later. But they did show themselves quite well in that war. Notice how there's a piece of track, a spare track under the gun here on the front glacis plate. That was something, they increased stowage there with subsequent marks. By the way, the Mark II was up to 49 tons, and by this point we're over 50 tons. So we are getting heavier. But we are improving the engine, so it kind of is a wash. Pretty neat. But they wouldn't stop here, of course not. So that turret is very sticky. Would you rotate? I need to oil this. Anyway, let us move on. This is a Mark 5/1, because now names are going to get very confusing. Used by Australia in Vietnam. Yeah, with the Mark 5, of course, like I said, we went to the new machine guns, and we would go to a more powerful engine and a few other things. With the 5/1, we increase the armor plating, at least in some areas, and we actually add a second coaxially mounted machine gun. This is a 50 caliber M2 Browning. This is used to range the main gun. Yeah, before lasers and everything, that's what they would use. So we had that, and we had the two 30 caliber Brownings, another coax, and then one on the roof for the cupola. And we have thicker armor. Now there's another version known as the Mark 5/2 that took the Mark 5 and replaced the 20-pounder, the 84mm gun, with the new L7 105mm rifled gun, which would later go on to be used on the Leopard and even the Abrams tank. It was just a development and whatnot to keep up with the Joneses in the Cold War. And if a tank had both upgrades, the armor and the new main gun, it became a Mark 6. And if we added IR equipment, extra stuff, it became a Mark 6-1. And from there, the Mark 7 would introduce additional fuel tankage, finally, and rework the engine decking a bit. And then if we up-armored it, we'd have a Mark 7/1. You get the idea. It goes up to Mark 13, and with slashes and dashes and mashes in between. I think it gives you the point. This is a pretty darn upgradable tank. Something that Israel actually took full advantage of. They fielded hundreds of these starting in 1959. They would use them in the 6 Days War, 1967, the Yom Kippur War, 1973, and in Lebanon in 1982. They would also upgrade a lot of theirs, even having their own version and variant. And it's kind of interesting because Israel had the Centurion, and it would fight against Centurions fielded by Egypt and Jordan. It's a whole thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about Israeli-British relations when we get to the Chieftain. But, yeah, Israel. And these are huge tank battles in these wars. We're talking thousands of tanks in the field at the time. So anyway, it continues in British service, and Australia would first send an armored corps to Vietnam in 1967, but these were driving APCs. I think it was mostly the M113. While the troops did well, they were criticized for being basically unable to project any kind of offensive power. And so after a few months of this, the government decided to order a squadron sent over, and the first 8 Australian Centurions, these would be Mark 5s or Mark 5/1s, were sent over in February of 1968, and by April-May they were already engaging the enemy and really earning themselves a great reputation yet again. The crews liked them. Their maneuverability was great in the jungle, especially that ability to go in reverse, and their relatively low top speed was not a hindrance in this environment. And by this time, a lot of the bugs and kinks have been worked out, and heck, now we have up to 3 machine guns on these things. And even though the 50 cal was meant to be a ranging gun, the Aussies did use it. They had usually carried about 60, 62 rounds for the main gun. They would carry 4,000 rounds for the 50 caliber. And they carried up to 9,000 rounds for the two 7.62 Browning machine guns. Yeah, they were well armed. Give them that. By September of 1968, there would be 16 operating in country. And it maximum at any one time, there were about 20. In total, about 58 Aussie Centurions would rotate through, but one group would come in, the other one would go out. And of these, the majority would be damaged in combat. Luckily, only about half a dozen were actually damaged so much that they were lost, and only a couple of crew were actually killed. Others were injured, of course, but yeah. They had a very respectable combat record, and they were just a welcome sight, and they were said to be worth their weight in gold. And the Aussies did kind of do their own mods and updates. Like I said, this one has a spotlight here, searchlight. It has two wheels under the gun here on the front plate. And it has the side skirts, although the Aussies would often remove these. This actual tank started off as a Mark III, and this is the so-called atomic tank that survived a nuclear blast in 1953, I believe it was. Yeah, it literally survived the nuclear blast during testing and was put back into service. That's pretty interesting. So that's kind of why I wanted this model. And it would serve into the 70s. The Aussies would continue to deploy these in Vietnam until about 71, and then they would withdraw them. But in other nations, like I said, Israel is still using them. South Africa was using them. They were still very much around. In the UK, they did start to scale them back at this point. Again, the Chieftain is coming online. But they would turn them into support vehicles, like armored recovery vehicles and what have you. So the Centurion's day is not quite over yet. As you might imagine, this is a bit of a daunting video to do, and if I've seemed like I've rushed through things or intentionally overlooked things, sorry, but it's long enough as is. These models are quite nice. They're Hobby Master, so yeah. They have the moving guns, the moving turret. Most of what Hobby Master makes are the Mark Vs. They do have some older Mark IIIs, but not a lot of difference. You have a little bit different shape to the turret. I just couldn't find a Mark III. Again, at least two of these started off as Mark IIIs, but they were updated. Just to get a 5.1, that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if they do a 5.2 or a 6 with the 105 gun. They probably do, but I haven't seen one. I like this one for having the early gun. Kind of reminds me of the Mark III quite a bit. It's almost a transitional tank. The Brits would not deploy these in the Falklands, at least not as tanks. I think there might have been one utility vehicle there on the beaches, like a beach recovery vehicle. They would stay in second line service, again using as engineering support vehicles throughout the 80s, and they would send 12 to support Operation Granby in 1991 in Desert Storm. These never saw direct combat. However, despite that, 3 of them were actually lost to accidents, and at least one I know was a friendly fire accident, maybe 2. But luckily no one was killed. A couple injuries, no deaths. And that was pretty much the end of its time in the British military. It had been replaced by the Chieftain, and at this point it's being replaced by the Challenger even. In other militaries, like in Israel, they were also being drawn down finally by the 1990s. But other places like South Africa would continue to update theirs and field theirs, and even today there are a few Centurion hulls rolling around the world. It was an amazingly forward-thinking tank for World War II. The larger turret really meant that it could be upgraded. It went from a time of having a 76mm main gun to a 105. That's impressive. Mounting up to 3 machine guns, crew of 4, pretty comfortable 3-man turret, good maneuverability, good reverse. The only real major dings against it, top speed was not great. and the initial range especially was pathetic. Even the later range wasn't great, and a lot of them would have an auxiliary fuel tank drum attached to the back. That's about the only negative you can say about it. Otherwise, it was a really good tank that served the British well. And this really was where the heavy cruiser met the infantry tank. And there, like I said, there was the Conqueror, but they only made like 60 of those. And they really only served in West Germany for a brief time in the mid-50s. That was just to counter like the last of the heavy tanks from Russia, like the T-10. Once that was no longer a factor, this was a better tank, and kind of combining it with the 120mm gun of the Conqueror would get us our next tank. But that's for another video. I think this one's gone on long enough. So do please let me know what you think. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. All that fun, good stuff. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.